Welcome to our afternoon webinar series. I just want to start out by saying we're having a little bit of technical difficulties, so I apologize. I hope everything will be clear. All right, so let me first start off by introducing today's speaker, Kimberly Jones. Kimberly A. Jones joined the curatorial staff of the National Gallery in 1995 as assistant curator of French paintings, a former museum fellow at the Musée National du Château de Pau and the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. She has been the curator of 19th century French paintings at the gallery since 2016. Jones has lectured and published widely on a variety of topics related to French art of the 19th century. She has served as curator and catalog author of a number of exhibitions in her field, including Degas at the Races, Edouard Vuillard in the Forest of Fontainebleau, painters and photographers from Corot to Monet, from Impressionism to Modernism, the Chester Dale Collection, Impressionist and Post-Impressionist masterpieces from the National Gallery, Degas and Cassatt, Frédéric Bazille and the Birth of Impressionism, and most recently, Degas at the Opera. Her current project is Paris, 1874, the Impressionist Moment, which she'll be speaking about today. Jones has a PhD and an MA from University of Maryland with specialization in 19th century European art, as well as a dual degree in art history and studio art from Western Maryland College, now McDaniel College. Again, might have some reverb because I'm gonna take Kimberly off of mute. Okay, Kimberly, you're off mute. And I am, without further ado, going to share my screen. Bear with me, everyone, and thank you so much for your patience.
So today I was invited to speak about, I wanted to talk about women in 1874, the tale of two exhibitions, very much like the current exhibition at the National Gallery, Paris, 1874, the Impressionist Moment, which brought together artists both from the Société anonyme exhibition as well as the Paris Salon. In the catalog of that first inaugural exhibition of the group that came to be known as the Impressionists, there's a single woman on the list, and of course that is Berthe Morisot. Morisot showed multiple works, 4 paintings, 2 pastels, and 3 watercolors. Very significant display. Next slide, this is showing the works that she was exhibiting. Morisot was a mainstay of the Impressionist group. She showed in 7 of the 8 Impressionist shows. The only one she did not participate in was in 1879. She had given birth to her daughter a few months prior, which I think is a very legitimate reason to not participate in a group exhibition. In fact, she exhibited in more group exhibitions than most of her male counterparts, including Monet and Renoir. She was actually, among all the artists who showed at the Société Anonyme inaugural show, she was probably the best reviewed of all of the artists. She received consistently good praise of her work. For example, Jules Castagnery, in his review, said, Berthe Morisot has wit to the tips of her fingers, especially at her fingertips. What fine artistic feeling. You cannot find more graceful images, more deliberately and delicately than Berceau and Cache-Cache. I would add that here, the execution is in complete accord with the idea to be expressed. Next slide. Hopefully the slide showing the cradle and Cache-Cache, the two of the paintings which were consistently singled out for praise. Now, Morisot wasn't actually the only woman who did show in that exhibition. Next slide. There is another very shadowy figure, the Comtesse de Luchère. Her name does not appear in the catalog. That in itself is not entirely surprising. There were a number of works shown in the Société show that were hors catalogue, that were not listed, no other artists. I will not read this wall of text, but it is this review by Marc de Montifaut that appeared in L'Artiste on the first Impressionist show that singles her out and gives this very lengthy description of a painting she showed of the Lieutenant of Lancers. This is all we know. There is no other reference or record of this painting. The artist herself remains indeed a shadowy figure, but the fact that she's popping up in this review suggests that indeed there was a second woman. Next slide. And since we're talking about women in 1874, let's just sort of take a sidestep to talk about Marc de Montifaut. the one critic who mentioned the Comtesse de Chartres. She, in fact, was a very successful art critic for l'artiste. And in 1865, at the age of 16, she began writing under the name Marthe de Montbouffon, which was not her birth name. And she remained an art critic for the journal L'Artiste, covering art, music, and literature for a period of 12 years. And several photographs of her, including this one, she is shown wearing men's clothing, oftentimes with short hair. She would dress as a man when researching at the Bibliothèque Nationale, and also probably dressed as a man when she visited exhibitions and over the course of her work as critic. And she used the names Marthe and Marie interchangeably as signatures in her personal correspondence, and with some friends alternately referring to she and he. So she is indeed a fine example of gender nonconformity. So obviously in 1874, women were taking all kinds of characters. Next slide. There was almost a third one in that first Impressionist show, and that was Hélène Bertaux, the sister of Berthe Morisot. The two sisters had exhibited side by side at the Salon every year from 1864 to 68. But once she married in March of 1869, she no longer created art or exhibited. Next slide. Now there's a letter that Degas wrote to Madame Morisot in March of 1874 to plead the case in favor of the first Impressionist show. She was trying to win the support of Madame Morisot, a very strong personality, and he recognized that if he wanted to get Berthe on board, he needed her mother's support. He had already written to Berthe about the exhibition, and she was interested, but he wanted Madame the stamp of approval from Madame. And in that letter, he said of the exhibition, it is realist enough in scope that a realist would not want to miss it. And besides, we feel that Miss Berthe Morisot's name and talent are too valuable to have to do without. But in that letter, he continues and says, I don't know if Mrs. Fontenot, the married name of Edna, is with you, and if she would kindly remember with regard to the exhibition, that she was once a painter, just like her sister, and that she may well still be. It's interesting to think that Degas, who knew both sisters, wanted her involvement in that exhibition. And I think it speaks very strongly to how important the female presence could have been and would in later years become for the Impressionist group. Next slide. The question, of course, with Berthe Morisot is why does she throw in the Impressionists? The standard story is she had been fairly successful at the Paris Salon. She had been accepted every year between 1864 and 1870. But she also found herself frequently rejected. Usually only half of the work she submitted were accepted. The Salon was a challenging situation, and nowhere did that show more clearly when considering the career path of her contemporary, to a certain extent, rival Eva Gonzalez. Gonzalez, of course, never joined the Impressionist group. She, like her mentor Manet, stayed firmly in the Salon camp. And she had a very similar trajectory to Berthe, being accepted, but also struggling with rejection. Next slide. In 1873, she was rejected at the Salon and participated in the Salon de l'Effusée. Her one rejected work, the Osier Beds, Farm and Brie, was then shown at the Salon de l'Effusée. The critic Louis Hainaut, in fact, criticized the jury that year for its extreme, almost draconian severity, his words, towards women artists in particular that year. In 1874, Gonzalès submitted two more works, a pastel and a painting. The pastel was accepted, but the painting was rejected. So this was the struggle that all artists, but particularly women artists, faced. And Manet, who was, of course, also a friend and supporter of Morisot, strongly discouraged her participation in the Impressionist group, but nevertheless, she proceeded. And of course, history has proven that she made the right decision. Now, I wanted to sort of backtrack a bit to talk a little bit about the artistic climate for women, particularly around the Salon in 1874. Next slide. In this chart, you will see sort of the breakdown of women's participation in the Salon of 1874. Of the 2,500 artists who showed in 1874, only 266, about 10%, were women. You'll also notice that of the 3,700 works on display, only 417 were by women. Again, a little over 10%. This is slightly less than in 1873. The exact number is actually 10.6% of works, as opposed to 11.3 the previous year. You will also notice what happens, though, when it comes to the issue of accolades, so its success at the Salon. Of 169 works acquired by the state, only 6 belonged to women artists. And when it came to awards, there were no medals given to women in 1874. That was not uncommon at all. Women were rarely medaled at the Salon. You see the next slide, please. There's also the question of what women were painting, what kind of media. You'll notice about 37% of works shown by women were paintings, but then you have this very large percentage, 41%, this largely decorative arts. And this is where women really were sort of pushed to the side. They were showing things like miniatures, painting on porcelain, pastels, minor works, minor genres, things that were less significant and given less attention by the critics and collectors. Next slide. And then, of course, there's the kinds of subjects women are painting. You will notice that 180% of the works shown by women were portraits. That was very much considered domain. The dominant attitude towards women was they were imitators. They were not creators. They could copy what they saw, so they could do still life and portraits, and to some extent landscape, but more imaginative subjects. History painting, anything that had required intellect was clearly above and beyond the needs of women. So that is sort of the baseline attitude that women were struggling with. And certainly when you see the kinds of works that were getting that kind of public attention, you can see where the struggle lay. Next slide. This slide is a photograph of some of the works acquired at the Salon of 1874. The painting that is outlined is a floral still life by an artist we've never heard of before, Louise Daroux, called the Bouquet Villageois, that was acquired by the state for 1,200 francs. Next slide. Here you see 4 works acquired by women, works by women acquired at the Salon. In blue, a pastel by Marie Dubois of the Fleur de Mai. The work surrounded in yellow by Madame Caroline Guézé d'Alandon. So I'm showing you also Madame Parmentier's self-portrait miniature, and Madame Clémentine's Pépin's is a copy after Mona Lisa. So you can see these are small-scale, minor works that are being acquired, with the exception of one of them. None of them going for more than 300 francs. So small prices, insignificant works. This is a really hard realm into which a woman can actually become professional. And then next slide. The one outlier here is this sculpture by Hélène Bertaux. And I'm going to return to this, so just for opinions for the moment. What I thought I would do, just briefly, is talk about those other women, 266 women at the Salon of 1874. Almost all of which are completely lost to the sands of time. We know nothing about them. Those 4 little miniature works, I found no trace of them. I don't know where they went. There's no record of their attribution. They just simply disappeared, much like the women artists. But there were women in 1874 who were starting to make a name for themselves, who actually are remembered, though not as well as they anticipated. So there's a lot of work yet to be done on women artists. One of those women artists, next slide, is Louise Abimont. She actually made her debut at the Salon of 1874 at the age of 20. She, like many women, had studied under Charles Chaplin, as well as Jean-Jacques Henner and Carlos Derain. In 1874, she showed a portrait of a woman, which is currently lost. So I'm showing you, it's sort of similar works. One, a portrait from 1875, and a little oil sketch of a seaside scene, which is dated 1874. She showed a portrait in 1876. She showed a portrait of Sarah Bernhardt, the great actress, and this was really the painting that really launched her career and made a name for herself. She specialized in portraits and genre scenes, and of course, her relationship with Sarah Bernhardt, who is largely considered to be her intimate friend, possible lover, certainly that relationship between them is very profound and very important. Next slide. So it's not surprising that Sarah Bernhardt also made her debut at the Salon in 1874. Bernhardt, of course, is well known as one of the leading actresses, one of the leading lights on the stage in the 19th century, but she was also a very talented sculptress. And she showed in 1874 a bust of a Mademoiselle Vigie. These two artists had met in 1871, Bernhardt and Abima in 1871, and remained close until Sarah Bernhardt's death. And so you'll notice one of these sculptures, the marble on right, is actually a bust of Louise Abima herself. Next slide. Then you have portraitists like Nelly Jacquemont, Conalie Barbe Iefante Jacquemont, which is a great name, known as Nelly. She showed a talent for art at a very young age. She entered the workshop of Leon Coignet, but Coignet didn't teach women. It was his sister. And basically, to train with his sister, she just made copies of her brother's paintings. So that was sort of the kind of training women were allowed to have. But she was an extremely gifted young artist who debuted at the Salon in 1863 at the age of 22. She actually won medals in 1868, 1869, 1870. And by 1874, she was listed as hors concours. She was commissioned to do a number of portraits, including one of President Adolphe Thiers. And in 1872, she was commissioned to paint the portrait of the collector Edward André, a painting that she showed in the Salon of 1874, which you see here. You may know the name Edward André, if you don't, because you know the name Jacquemont André. So he was a great collector. The two married in 1881. It's largely a marriage of convenience. The family just wanted him to be married, and so she stepped up. But the two had got on very well. They were well aligned and had a shared passion for collecting. So she continued to paint, but after her marriage, she largely turned away from that career and focused on collecting. And of course, the two of them built a stunning collection, which they turned into, after her death, into the Musée Jacquemont André, which is a celebration of their great collecting tastes. Next slide. And then, of course, there are the foreign artists who were coming into Paris. Paris was a great magnet for artists around the globe. One such artist is Elizabeth Jane Gardner, an American, who was born in 1837 in Exeter, New Hampshire. And like many young aspiring artists, she traveled to Paris in 1864 with Imogen Robinson, a former teacher pros, to pay her rent. She spent time copying paintings by contemporary artists at the Musée Luxembourg and old masters at the Louvre. The Louvre is going to actually be kind of a leading character in the story of women artists. She took life classes at the Gobelin factory in 1873, entered the Académie Julian, where she studied with Jules Lefebvre and William Bouguereau. Of course, she is best known today as Jane Gardner Bouguereau. The two of them courted for 17 years and only married in 1896 after his rather tyrannical mother died. And she took that in proudly, but she had a very successful career at the Salon up to that point. And it's notable that in 1874, she did not exhibit as a student of Bouguereau, but rather Huguenot. Sadly, her painting of Corinne was destroyed. It was actually in the Tuileries Palace. It must be not Tuileries Palace. It was another palace and it was destroyed. So we do not have paintings. So I'm showing you representative works. This, unfortunately, is also a theme of this lecture. The difficulty not only of sort of excavating these artists, but also tracking down their works. This was a real challenge we had with the Paris 1874 exhibition, and women artists proved particularly challenging. So many of the works that I am showing you today are not necessarily the works shown in 1874, but are representative. As I said, there's a lot of work yet to be done. Next slide. Another foreign artist on the scene in Paris in 1874 was Laura Alma-Tadema. She was born Laura Teresa Epps. She was a British painter specializing in domestic and genre scenes of women and children. Her two sisters were also painters. In 1869, at the age of 17, she met Lawrence Alma-Tadema, and he was immediately smitten with her. He was recently widowed, and at age 33, there was a bit of an eyebrow-raising age discrepancy. When the Franco-Prussian War broke out, he left Paris and came to London, largely because of her being there. She studied with him for a time, and finally, her father relented, and they were married in 1871. And she debuted at the Salon of 1873, one of only 2 English women to show that year, with her painting The Mirror, which you see here on the left. And then she also exhibited a still life in 1874, which tragically is missing, but she's a very interesting and underappreciated painter. Next slide. Another underappreciated painter is Victoria Duboc, better known as Victoria Duboc Saint-Latour. Yet again, another one of these pairings. Her family had lived in Frankfurt when she was young, and she studied medicine and taught letters. She also trained in a workshop for young girls run by Fanny Charon. She was a music lover and a pianist. She was a very, very talented, very erudite young painter. Excuse me. And she also studied and copied works at the Louvre, her major site. And it was there in 1869 that she met her future husband and collaborator, Henri Latour, while both of them were copying Correggio's The Mystic Marriage of St. Catherine. What a very sweet and romantic story that indeed is. They were married in 1878. She, however, continued to exhibit under her maiden name until 1901. She last showed at the Salon in 1902. And so she actually was, again, another very successful artist. She had painted copies after Pietro de Cortona and the Virgin Christ Child, which were commissioned by the state. And she showed still life painting. And in the Salon of 1872, one of her still lifes, Fruits and Flowers, was purchased at the Salon of 1872 for 500 francs. Next slide. She again showed still life paintings in 1874. This was her bread and butter. And she frequently is dismissed as just being sort of a pale shadow of her husband, yet she was practically painting these kinds of paintings before they met and continued to paint. So there is definitely, as is often the case with women artists, a bit of a slippage, with their husbands getting a lot more credit for their accomplishments than they necessarily deserve. Next slide. And then, of course, there are the future Impressionists. Marie Cassatt and Marie Bracquemond, both of whom showed at the Salon of 1874, and both of whom can be seen in the current exhibition here in Washington. I don't want to talk about, dwell on Marie Cassatt. She has been given a great deal of attention, but rather I'd like to sort of talk a little bit about Marie Bracquemond, who is the third, official Impressionist woman, and the one who's received the least attention over the years. Next slide. It's very interesting to note that she and her future husband, her husband, Félix Bracquemond, lived at Rue de l'Université number 19. It's the same building as the Latour couples. It's very interesting these power couples are living in close proximity. Now, Marie Bracquemond never undertook formal training in the way that many of the other women I've been talking about did. She did receive some limited instruction, however, from Jean-Auguste Dominique Ang, the very awe-inspiring and intimidating neoclassical painter. The critic Philippe Berthe actually referred to her as one of the most intelligent pupils in Ang's studio. Bracquemond herself was a little more ambivalent. The severity of Monsieur Ang frightened me, she would write, because he doubted the courage and perseverance of a woman in the field of painting. He would assign to them only the painting of flowers, of fruits, of still life, portraits, and genre scene. This, again, is keeping with sort of the standards, attitudes toward women artists at the time. They were mere copyists who were only capable of imitating what they saw with their own eyes rather than being more creative. She, however, was a little more on the creative side. Next slide. She exhibited at the Salon. She made her debut in 1859 at the age of 19, under the name of Mademoiselle Antoine Marie Pasquieu, which is her maiden name. And then she exhibited from 1864 to 1869 under her name, Mademoiselle Marie Pasquieu Piveron. So this too complicates the narrative. You have to sort of track down multiple names. Then she returns in 1874 under her married name, showing painting of Marguerite, which I showed previously. Despite Ang's conviction that women were incapable of creativity, She proved to be quite talented and creative. She showed several portraits, but also a painting of the tormented Tabulus at the Salon of 1867. And she was commissioned by Empress Eugenie to do a painting of Cervantes in prison, conceiving of Don Quixote, which was shown at the Salon of 1868. And this was the painting that was destroyed in Tuileries Palace when it was burned. She was also asked by Comte de Nouveautel, the Director General of French Museums, to make important copies of works at the Louvre. It was while working at the Louvre that she met her future husband, Marie Bracquemond. They married in 1869. The two worked together at the Haviland studio at Auteuil, where her husband was the artistic director. She designed plates and service paintings and executed large tile panels. Next slide. But she also produced these very interesting sort of troubadour style paintings early in her career. I'm showing you two of them here. The one on the right, Reading, is related to possibly a very elaborate study for her painting Reading, which was the last work she showed at the Salon in 1875. Next slide. And I just wanted to show you some of these really interesting studies she does for these troubadour works. This is not what you think of as being impressionist, and yet this was the mode in which she was operating. Next slide. Finally, in 1879, she takes the plunge and joins the Impressionist group at the behest of Edgar Degas. Degas was the great recruiter for the group, and in fact brought all of the women into the group. Marie Bracquemond, Cassatt, as well as Marie Bracquemond. She exhibited with the Impressionists in 1879, 1880, and in the final Impressionist show in 1886. Now, her husband hated her change of style. He did not approve of this direction in her work, despite the fact that he showed with the Impressionists in their first 3 exhibitions. He did not like this turn in career and was not only dismissive, but really bullying her to turn away from this art. He did not like the influence of Degas and Monet. He did not like the changing palette. He did not like her emphasis on scenes of modern life. And unfortunately, in 1890, she finally gave in to her husband's bullying and abandoned painting almost entirely. There's very little produced by her after that point, which is a very sad ending to that particular chapter. Next slide. But I don't want to end on such a downer of a note, because there were other women who thrived in the Salon system of 1874. One of them is Henriette Brown, who is an artist who is tragically underappreciated today. She was a powerhouse of her age and one of the most successful women artists of the 19th century, yet remarkably underappreciated. Henriette Brown was actually a pseudonym. Her name was Madame Jules de Sceaux, born Sophie de Boutellier. She was born in Paris, the daughter of the Comte de Boutellier. And what's interesting is her relationship with her mother. Her mother, who had been widowed at a young age from her husband. And she supported herself by taking music lessons. She was a very talented musician, and that was how she supported herself. And she encouraged her daughter to pursue the arts, not necessarily for her own edification, which was perfectly normal for women of her class, to sort of learn the arts, to be well-rounded and talented. Rather, her mother recognized this would be a skill that she could fall back on if things went bad. If life went sideways, she could support herself as an artist. And she showed extraordinary talent as an artist. She studied drawing first under Émile Perrin, and then under the ubiquitous Charles Chapelain, who was the great teacher for many women artists at the time, and then made her debut at the Salon in 1853 under the pseudonym of Henriette Brown. This was the name of her maternal grandmother. This was a way of distancing her personal life from her professional life, particularly as a member of the nobility. Being a professional artist would have been extraordinarily scandalous. She specialized in genre scenes, especially Near Eastern and religious subjects, and also worked as an engraver, another surprising term. Next slide. At the World's Fair of 1855, all 5 of the paintings she exhibited sold. One of them, The School for the Poor, X, was acquired by Napoleon III and won a third-class medal. In 1857, her painting of the Puritans, which you see here on left, was purchased by Empress Eugène for 6,000 francs, which is a very substantial sum of money. And it also won her another third-class medal. She continued to receive patronage from the imperial couple. In 1859, she showed the Sisters of Mercy, painting on the right, which caused an absolute sensation at the Salon, winning her a third-class medal, and was acquired for the princely sum of 12,000 francs, which again, a strong indicator of her enormous talent. This painting was shown in London, where it launched her international fame. And by 1860, at least 8 of her works had been purchased by British collectors. Curiously, the British loved these sort of genre scenes of education and children, whereas the French would much prefer her Orientalist works. Next slide. Now, in 1853, she had married Henri Jules de Sceaux, who was a French diplomat. And she accompanied on these travels, and this opened up her world. It went all over Italy and Switzerland, but it was the travels in the Middle East, and particularly in Constantinople and Egypt, which really opened up her world and opened up a whole new realm of art for her. She actually said that all women should go to Turkey, in fact. During these travels, she, through her connections with her husband, she and her world connection, she was able to enter spaces other artists couldn't, such as harems. Men were precluded from entering harems, but she was welcome to do so. And so she begins increasingly to show scenes of Oriental art. Next slide. Now, at the Salon of 1874, Henriette Brown was well represented. She showed 3 paintings, 2 portraits, and an Orientalist subject, but she also makes a cameo, and that is in Camille Cabillot-Lassalle's painting of the Salon of 1874, one of the lovely little gems we have in our exhibition. Cabillot-Lassalle painted the figures in this work, and then he invited 6 artists to paint their own works. These were the works they were showing in the Salon of 1874. And it's very interesting to note that Henriette Brown is one of the 6 artists that he invites, which I think speaks to her status in the contemporary art circles. And this is the portrait of Monsieur E.S., a painting which sadly is currently unlocated. Next slide. And then, of course, the real standout of the painting she showed in 1874 is the poet, the Copts of Upper Egypt, which we have in our current exhibition. I guess to give you a sense of the kinds of Orientalist work she does, these very sort of mundane, almost banal subjects, but treated with a sort of a dignity and sensibility rather than leaning towards the drama and the overt sexuality and sensuality that is so typical of French Orientalist works. These are very distinctive, and it's not surprising that they would be so attractive and successful. Next slide. The last artist that I wanted to highlight is Hélène Bertaux, another artist who is tragically underappreciated today. The fact that she is a sculptor is all the more significant. You might remember I showed you earlier the chart, only 5% of the work shown in 1874 were by women were sculptures, which is a very small number. Now, Bertaux was born in Paris under the name of Joséphine Charlotte Hélène Pilat, and she began studies at the age of 12 with her mother's companion and her father, the sculptor Pierre Hébert. She debuted at the Salon of 1849 under the name of her first husband, François Augustin Alluti, but she separated from him, and in 1854 began signing her works Madame Léon Bertaux, the name of her companion, another sculptor. They weren't yet married. She just basically decided, yeah, I'm going to be Madame Léon Bertaux from this point forward. She only married him in 1866 after her husband's death, and they'd been cohabitating for a long time. So she's a little scandalous, Madame Bertaux, which I really appreciate about her. But she was also extraordinarily successful. She got her first commission. Her first recognition came in 1864 when she received a commission for a pediment. Excuse me, next slide. I'm showing you the Louvre pediments right now. So she actually received 2 commissions, one in 1864 for a pediment on the Louvre, which shows navigation. And then 14 years later, she received a second commission to do the pediment, which shows legislation, and 2 side bas-reliefs, one showing Charlemagne and the other showing Moses. This is part a very large decorative program carried out in the 1860s and 70s to decorate the Louvre. And she was one of only 3 women who participated in the project. But they are really extraordinary works. So she also received other commissions for churches around Paris, as well as the newly reconstructed Hôtel de Ville. So she's not painting, she's not producing little delicate tabletop sculptures. She is producing monumental sculptures, which again is so atypical for a woman artist of her time. Next slide. I'm showing you here 2 more of her sculptures. The Assumption of the Virgin, which actually was first shown in plaster and later in bronze, which actually became a church decoration, as well as the Young Woman Bathing, which was shown at the Salon of 1873 and was acquired by the state. She had, again, a remarkable track record of success as a sculptor. Next slide, hopefully I'm showing you now the young Gaulish prisoner, but might have messed up. This is sort of her crowning achievement as a sculptor, at least in my opinion. And she showed the sculpture or variation 3 times. The first in 1864, she showed a plaster version of the sculpture, which won her a medal. She showed it again in marble in 1867, which was also acquired by the French state for 5,000 francs and won her a medal. That's what you see on the left. And on the right, she showed a bronze version, which was acquired by the state for 4,000 francs. 1874. So this is the work at the current exhibition. And in 1889, she won a gold medal at the World's Fair, the first woman sculptor ever to receive a gold medal for sculpture. So when I say that she is an extraordinarily successful and powerhouse of a figure, working in a male-dominated field such as sculpture, probably the most manly and sort of testosterone-driven art field of the time, because it was considered it requires so much strength and sort of fortitude. And she not only succeeded, she exceeded glowingly. But as much as her career as an artist is remarkable, I also just want to conclude by talking a little bit about her career as an advocate for women and women artists. In 1873, she opened a drawing and modeling workshop for women artists. And then in 1880, she opened a sculpture school exclusively for women artists. In 1881, next slide, this should be this last slide, she served as the first president of the Union of Women Painters and Sculptors, which she founded. And this was a society that was to create community for women artists, to allow them to work together, to help one another, and to create opportunities for women artists to succeed in a male-dominated field. And in this role as the president of the Union of Women Painters and Sculptors, she worked tirelessly on behalf of women artists, and it was thanks to her efforts, as well as those of her successive presidents, that finally, in 1897, the École Nationale Supérieure des Beaux-Arts, the École des Beaux-Arts, the great art school of Paris, was finally open to women. They had not allowed women through its doors until 1897, which is shocking. It's really the last major art school in Europe to sort of limit access to women. And she also helped in 1903 to allowing women to now participate in the Prix de Rome competition, which came as quite a shock to the members of the French Academy, who weren't informed in advance that the Minister of Fine Arts had made that decision, and they were not happy about that. But nevertheless, through her efforts and the efforts of many other great women like her, new avenues were opened up. And 1874 really allows us an interesting and very exciting window into that world. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. I actually would like to start out with one question. I have a number of questions, and thank you so much for this excellent presentation, despite all of our little technical snafus. I think we've come full circle, and you were able to instruct us and show us a lot of things that certainly I didn't know before. One of the questions that I had certainly is about the social profile of some of these young artists. Certainly these were women, or I'm assuming these were women of a higher class. They were being supported by their families, and that support enabled them to go to school. But I'm wondering if any of them perhaps kind of came from less traditional or accepted paths. One of the questions I had was, you mentioned the name, I think it was Marie Bracquemond, who used multiple names throughout her career. I'm wondering if women also used male pseudonyms to either gain access into the salon if they didn't have that support either coming from their families or the establishment in some way.
I mean, it's entirely possible. As I said, these are so many lesser known artists that it's really hard to tell sort of where, if they are. I mean, there were 2,500 artists showing in 1874. And the vast majority of them are completely lost to us today. So I think it's entirely possible that there were some, artists who actually were maybe using pseudonyms of man. We don't know. There's so much we don't know. But as to your previous question, I mean, Hélène Bertaux actually was working class. She did not come from a money family. I mean, she took one of the routes to be trained. She trained with her father. Mm-hmm. And so that was how she sort of came to it rather than tutors, as was the case of artists like Berthe Morisot. And Marie Bracquemond also came from a very sketchy background. Her family was a very troubled family life. Her parents, it was a very unhappy marriage. So I don't think it was quite as stable as some of these. It's interesting where you see the parents, like Berthe Morisot's mother, when people said, don't let your artists become painters, her mother doubled down and hired tutors. She got Corot, got Guichard. So some families were incredibly supportive, some were more neutral. It's the whole gamut. And I said, this is just the beginning. I think there's a lot more work to be done. I've only just sort of started digging into some of these figures, and I really want to do a lot more, but there's a lot to get to. Right.
You talked a little bit about the art market and the market reception to some of these artists at the Salon. And I'm wondering if that market reception crossed over to when they started, or a select few of them started to exhibit with the Impressionist group. What was the market appetite for some of these painters?
It really varied. I mean, portraiture obviously was very successful. I mean, I think part of the reason that Berthe Morisot went over the Impressionists is there was a possibility for sales. And she did initially, it took a while to sort of get off the ground, but that particular group proved very successful for her. The Salon, I mean, the state was a great sponsor, and a lot of the artists that I talked about, like Henriette Brown and Hélène Bertaux, had success with the state, but funds were limited. And they were very much for certain kinds of genres, certain kinds of works. And the smaller scale works, those miniatures, you couldn't feed your family with the kind of money we're getting from this. So they had to find other venues. But the Salon was a good way, if you got noticed, to just sort of get your name, raise your profile. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. You were mentioning sourcing these works for the exhibition and the difficulty you had. And I'm wondering, without, of course, revealing the identity of the lenders, the profiles of collectors today of these artists, are they, still in France in the smaller circles, or have they spread further afield? And what is the international awareness today of some of these artists?
I think right now, this is a really exciting moment, because I think at the moment people are starting to recognize that women artists really are interesting and are worth collecting. The prices still are shockingly low for these artists. I mean, it's really, if you've got the money, this is now the moment to buy. Great things do pop up on the market. Again, without giving anything away, we have collectors. Some are in France. We've got one in the UK, one in the US. So the collectors, they're varied, but there are things that are still coming up on the market. Yesterday, I had the privilege of meeting someone who's been collecting work by Berthe Morisot for some years. But the prices are still, he's able to acquire these things because the prices continue to be so low. So that's a big work on that.
And I'm wondering, I know the profile of this exhibition in terms of its content changed from its first venue in France to when it now is located in DC. And I'm wondering if you were able to get more women artists in your DC show than had appeared in France.
And we actually, I shouldn't admit, we actually have one less.
I see.
There was a painting by Adele Salon that was in Paris that we did not have. It was an issue of space that we the allotment of space that we had, and trying to fit it into the installation, we realized we just couldn't do it. But we do. But I mean, we do actually, you know, in our own collection, we have a lot by Morisot in particular. We really want to promote her in particular. I wish we had more Cassatt, but Cassatt only showed one work in 1874. But it's nice to have all three of the big Impressionist women in the exhibition, even if two of them, Cassatt and Bracquemond, were not yet Impressionist women. They didn't know it yet.
Okay. All right, I have a couple of questions here from the audience. One of them, I'm not sure if those of you who can see my screen could read these questions, but I'll read it for you. It's from Stephanie Fisher. I missed which artist you were referring, or you were referencing, whose husband didn't approve of her painting style and scenes of modern art. Can you modern life? Can you mention her again?
Marie Bracquemond.
Marie Bracquemond.
Her story I just find so sad because she was so talented, but this is a sadly very common story of women marrying and having to abandon. It's worse because he's an artist, and he did not support her in the way that, you know, Berthe Morisot was supported by her husband Eugène Manet, but Bracquemond was such a negative force in her life. And she did her works that she does with the Impressionists are amazing, but he hated it.
Oh, good.
And he just pressured her until she finally just quit. Because obviously they must have been fighting all the time.
Was that true of Fantin Latour and Victoria Dubourg, or did they have a cordial working relationship?
They had a more cordial relationship. So, you know, so Victoria Dubourg and Fantin Latour had, I think, a more amicable relationship. That she continued to paint and exhibit until 1902. The subject matter is very similar. She was a still life painter. That's all she really ever painted. And stylistically, she's very similar to her husband. So I oftentimes I think his reputation overshadows hers, although she was obviously extraordinarily talented. And of course, in her later years, she devoted so much of her energy to maintaining his legacy. As
is common, it seems. Yeah.
It's also important. I mean, these are stories that are sadly universal and eternal.
Right. Right. Well, one of our attendees to this lecture is pointing out there was a large auction in Paris of Marie Bracquemond and her husband, and the prices were healthy but not outrageous. Good to hear. So she's coming up. We're just about out of time, but I'm just wondering if you can remind us all how long the exhibition is up in DC.
The exhibition is up January 19th, so 2 months from today. So you still have some time, and I strongly encourage people to come. I mean, I know I'm biased, but there's some works here that a lot of works from private collections from around the world and things you probably will never see again. So I obviously biased in this, but I really think it is a really amazing, it's a highlight of my career. So.
Oh, fantastic. Well, Kimberly Jones, thank you so much. Really, this was so delightful. And it was a perfect way to round out our year-long series, Women of the Impressionist Circle. All of these recordings are saved for posterity and can be viewed through our website and on YouTube, including this one. So thank you again so much. Thank you, everyone who tuned in and bared with our technical difficulties. This was such a treat. Thanks again, Kimberly.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Have a good afternoon. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.